You are listening to the Hiking Radio Network, where we talk the walk with shows by hikers, about hikers, for everybody.
Mighty Blue on the Appalachian Trail, the ultimate midlife crisis. Join Steve and his guests every week as he staggers from Georgia to Maine.
Hi guys, and thanks for coming back to listen to the show. We're between Thanksgiving and Christmas, and you're listening to Mighty Blue on the Appalachian Trail, the ultimate midlife crisis. Now, I know that I'm always pretty enthusiastic about my guests, but really, today, I'm beside myself. You see, today, Larry Knight, or McGyver, is going to tell us all about his hike, and then he's going to tell us what he does now. At the end, there will be an amazing giveaway for which Larry is providing a question. So stay tuned and make sure that you enter this week's contest. And on the subject of contests, we have a winner for the signed copy of Ben Crawford's book about his amazing AT thru-hike along with his wife and 6 kids. I've also posted a short video of the drawing on my YouTube that I timed to come out at the same time as this podcast. I'll make the announcement after our second section of the show. That section is our ATC segment, and this time it's the turn of ATC's social media manager, Alyssa Reck. Alyssa's subject was Why Connections Matter, from engagement to responsible recreation, and I'll have a bit of further news about the ATC once we've spoken to Alyssa. Finally, Larry Luxembourg tells us about another legend of the trail, Gene Espy. It's funny, you know, Larry wrote this in the 1990s when people like Earl Schaefer and other AT legends were still alive, and I fully expected Gene Espy to be gone, but apparently he's still with us at the age of, I think, 93. How wonderful. So let's get going, and I'm delighted to be able to introduce you to Larry Knight, or McGyver. Our guest today is Larry Knight, or McGyver. He is a thru-hiker and will certainly be concentrating on his hike, but it's in another capacity that I've really got him on the show. Hi, Larry. How are you?
Good. How are you, Steve?
I'm good, thank you. We're going to talk about the other thing later, but let's start with your hiking life. As I understand it, it wasn't really a bucket list item, but you first stepped on the AT as a young boy. How did that come about?
I grew up in Jacksonville, Florida, and I was a member of a Boy Scout troop. And when I was 12 years old, our troop went in a bus up to Franklin, North Carolina to hike 50 miles on the Appalachian Trail. And the scoutmaster handed out hiking sticks to everyone. And on the bus trip back from that experience, we all carved in our hiking sticks, you know, our little memento. And I carved in that hiking stick, Appalachian Trail, 1965. And
Wow.
I actually carried that hiking stick with me on my thru-hike, which was exactly 50 years later.
That is remarkable. You know, funny enough, that was going to be my next question because I knew that had happened. So what made you think you wanted to hold on to that? Did you think you'd ever do the AT?
No, I did not. It was never a bucket list item. I enjoyed hiking, but it never was on my list. So, but how I held on to that stick for 50 years, I don't know. I guess I was just sentimental about it, but it came in handy.
I presume it must have been quite small at the time, though.
The stick it's about 4 feet tall. It worked well for me. I put a tennis ball on top of it so I could grasp it, a Wilson tennis ball. And so I called the hiking stick Wilson.
Nice.
It worked out quite well.
But life got in the way, as it tends to, and you eventually came to the trail, as you say, 50 years later. But you have been on it before in Georgia with your sons. How did that come about?
We lived in Marietta, Georgia, relatively near the trail. And when my sons were, 8, 9, 10 years old, we started backpacking together as father-son. And we did about half of Georgia just on weekend hikes. We never quite finished all of Georgia, but we enjoyed that experience together, hiking just weekend hikes, a few miles at a time.
You never thought at that stage that there was a possibility of going further?
Never. Never.
That's amazing. But it was a conversation with one of your sons up in Maine that finally got you on the trail. What was that about? How did that come about?
Well, I have 2 sons, and at the time, this was late 2014, one son lived in Georgia and the other son lived in Maine. He was in the Coast Guard. And so my Georgia son and I went up to Maine to visit my older son who lived in Rockland, Maine. And we were joking. I said, well, this has been a great trip, but the next time I come up here, maybe I'll just walk up there on the Appalachian Trail to visit you, since I had one son in Georgia, one son in Maine. And it really started out as a joke. And then I started thinking about it, and I was essentially between careers. And I went, well, what the heck? Maybe I'll just do this. And so I started researching it. And a few months later, I launched.
That is amazing. That really is. So really not having really wanted to do it. So have you ever considered or wondered what it was that motivated you to want to do it? Because as you know, unless you really want to do this hike, it's a tough thing to take on, isn't it?
Well, it is, but I probably didn't know how tough it was till I got into it.
It's a good thing, by the way.
Exactly. When I started, I wanted to give it a go. I really didn't know how far I could get. I had, some backpacking experience. My initial goal was just to get to mountain crossings. And if I could get to the North Carolina line, that would be great. The Smokies really is as far as I dared dream. But once I got to mountain crossings, like most people, I was in all the way.
Oh, really? You were? So you took to it. Why did you take to it? Because for many people, this is an ambition they really want to do. For you just thought, that'd be a nice thing to do. So what was it about those first 30 miles? I think it's about 30 miles or 28 miles to mountain crossings. What was it about the trail that really appealed to you at the time?
I think the initial appeal was the people I met, and it still is, even after having done the trail, the people were just wonderful, as you well know, from two different age groups completely. Yeah. And we all just got along so great. By that time I had a trail family, and it was just a wonderful experience just in those first 4 days. So I loved it.
I've thought about this a lot recently. I do interview a lot of people of a similar age to me. You're younger than me, but a relatively similar age to me. And we don't normally come into contact with other generations. What people tend to have their mates are normally the same age as them. But the opportunity to mix with other younger people is such a wonderful thing, don't you think?
Absolutely. It was these two disparate groups, I call them the 20-somethings, and then the semi-retired or fully retired people my age. And really, there didn't seem to be much generation gap. We would all sit around and talk about the same things and got along great. I love that experience. Yeah. And like you say, in normal life, it's hard to find that interaction with the younger people.
Sure. So how did you prepare then? Did you know what you needed in terms of, you obviously had your hiking stick, so you're ready to go as far as that was concerned. How did you prepare your backpack and your sleeping arrangements?
I had some gear, but I knew I needed to, get some better gear for this type of trip. And I had done some research, sure. But along this time, I was trying to get my head around the whole idea of actually doing this. And before I pulled the trigger, I decided I was going to go to ATKO, the Appalachian Trail Kickoff. And the night before ATKO started, I thought, well, I'm just going to do a one-night backpacking trip up to Springer Mountain and do a one-nighter up there, come back the next day for ATKO. And what happened on this little one-night backpack, it was early March. It was raining, of course. And then the rain started turning to sleet. And about the time I got to Nimblewell Gap, ice was freezing on my backpack. And I see this splash of color in the woods, which turned out to be an abandoned pack with a tent draped over it and all this gear scattered about. And I go, what is going on here? And there was a broken hiking pole there. And in my mind, I concocted the story that maybe somebody had slipped and was limping to the Linfoot Hike in, which was a side trail very nearby. So I thought, well, gee, I'm going to try to overtake this person and see if, they need help. So I get to the Linfoot Hike in. Nobody had come in. And to make a long story short, the next morning, I stayed at the Linfoot Hike in that night because it was too late to continue to Springer. The next morning, the directors at the Linfoot Hike in said, Larry, go get that gear. It's trail trash, bring it back to the Linfoot Hike in. We'll take a look. Sure. So I did. And we spread it all out on the tables there. And there were two pieces of identifying information in the pack. And one of the directors at the Linfoot Hike In looked up the name, and it was a fellow who had multiple larceny arrests and jail records. And so, because of that, we sent the pack down to the ranger to see if she needed to do something about that. But in the end, the ranger ended up giving me all of that gear, saying, "Larry, thank you for getting off the trail. We're going to keep the identifying pieces of information that were in there, but other than that, this gear is yours." And to ask about the preparation for the equipment, I took the pack, the tent, and the sleeping bag from that gear, that the big three, if you will. So that helped me a lot.
Oh my gosh, that is amazing. So it's funny how the trail does provide. I'm sure you found that on the trail anyway. I can't imagine that anybody has been provided for so much in certainly in those early days. So tell us about it. How did you cope physically with those early miles?
Physically, actually going back to that same hike, which was about 3 weeks before I actually launched, as it turns out. So I was coming down from the Linfoot Hike In, and my knee was hurting. It was locked up, and I was thinking to myself, well, gee, you're never going to hike 2,000 miles on this knee. But it calmed down after a couple of days, and I talked to my sons about it. They both wrestled in high school, and I said, "Have you ever had this particular knee pain?" And they said, "Oh yeah, just wear this little band around your knee, and that probably will take care of it." And it did. I don't know if it was the world's greatest placebo or if it actually worked, but I hiked the trail with that.
So you set out a few weeks later and you got back into it then. So you got into your rhythm. Were you enjoying it straight away?
I was, definitely, and like I say, we did have rain on those early days, even before mountain crossings, which washes a lot of people out. I dealt with that just fine. But really, what kept me going was the wonderful people. I just loved that.
Yeah. So what was you said when you first started, you thought it would be an achievement, not an achievement, but you were thinking only planning on getting to mountain crossings and then to the Smokies, hopefully. What was your mental approach like? Did you take on 100 miles at a time, or what were you thinking? Was there a time you eventually thought to yourself, I'm going to make it to Katahdin?
That moment came at mountain crossings. And in fact, I think for a lot of people it does. It was funny in those first 4 days when you're hiking the mountain crossings, you'll encounter somebody coming in the other direction and they say, they see your big pack and they go, "Oh, are you through hiking?" And almost to a man, we'd say, "Well, yeah, maybe, we think so." And then after mountain crossings, that same encounter would go like, "Oh, are you through hiking?" We go, "Oh, yes, absolutely."
Yeah, isn't that interesting? I mean, I always was. I always was hoping to get there. I don't think I ever answered it. I think I always said I was through hiking. I believe I did anyway. I always felt I was. It is unrealistic to think you can get all the way to the end. However, unless I got injured, I was going to get there. I was always determined to get there, and I'm sure you had that same sort of attitude once you got into it. But and I meant to ask you, why are you McGyver, by the way?
I came to the trail with no name. I found out that's what you should do, is be named. So it happened on about day number 4. I was showing some of the younger hikers how to do the PCT bear hang method. And the conversation simply went like this. I said, "Well, okay, if you don't have a carabiner, tie a bowline in the top of your bear bag, and then find a stick that you're going to use for a toggle and tie a clove hitch in that." And they stopped me right there and they go, "Wow, man, you know the names of knots? That is so MacGyver." And I go, "Well, I was in the Boy Scouts. That's a little overstated." So I didn't take that name because I thought it was a bit too much that I just knew the name of a couple of knots. But I eventually took the name because there was another name, which I won't mention, that I was trying to be tagged with that I did not want. So I took MacGyver.
Oh, dear. Well, so not only did you take your stick from your Boy Scout days, but you took your knowledge of knots, which is another thing that was obviously very useful on the trail. Knowing these knots is a kind of useful thing, isn't it? But you didn't finish that year, did you? What happened?
Well, somewhere in Virginia, I started developing plantar fasciitis. I didn't even know what that was till I Googled my symptoms. But I was dealing with it. I'd have to take off my boot, a couple of times a day and massage my foot and, do the stretches. But and I was getting along okay. I was moving more slowly. But what happened is I got to the first shelter in New York State, Wildcat Shelter. I still had my pack on and I was looking for a place to put my tent. And I stepped on a fist-sized rock and my plantar fascia tore. It actually ruptured. I felt it actually rip in half. And I thought, well, this is bad, but maybe I'll be better by morning. Well, no, I wasn't. And so I went to an Airbnb in Warwick, New York for a week, trying to rest my foot. And that was no good. So my son, who lived in Maine still, came and got me, took me to his house in Maine. And my plan there was to stay one more week with him and heal, and then southbound from Maine to New York. But even after that second week, my foot was done. So I had to pull the plug that year. But the very next spring, the foot healed, and I resumed where I left off and summited the next year.
So how many miles had you done when you had to leave the trail?
1,375.3.
Not that you remember it very well. So how did that feel? Did you always feel you were going to get back, or was it so disappointing for you that you thought, well, perhaps this isn't going to be for me?
No, I knew I wanted to come back, assuming my foot would heal, and it did. No, I definitely wanted to come back. And in fact, there were other people, some other hikers my age that had to get off for almost exact same problems, injuries. And to a person, they all came back and finished the next year. And some of the younger people that, also got off, they did not. But of course, they had to get on with their lives. Maybe they had colleges to go to or careers, whatever. I guess we had more liberty to come back the next year. So, but I was committed to come back. Yes.
And was it as good fun the second year, which is 2016 by now? Was it as good fun then as it was the first time, or did you feel you had to start the whole thing all over again?
It was not as much fun, but mainly because of the camaraderie was missing. I jumped ahead. I was ahead of the bubble because I had already hiked all the way to New York, and I didn't develop a trail family early on. From New York till Vermont, I really had no trail family. I was just hiking solo. The last two states, New Hampshire and Maine, I did have it was three of us hiking together, and that was great. And that became an experience similar to what I had the year before.
Yeah, it only struck me when I was putting these questions together this morning how different it must be to have your hike interrupted and have to redo it. And I would imagine that must be quite tough. You obviously eventually got to Katahdin, and as you know, it's such an epic day. What was your day like?
Well, first of all, I was still hiking with my my trail family, these two friends that I'd hiked the last two states with, and we had a great weather day. It wasn't 100% clear, but it was for Katahdin, it was a great day. But what happened to us? We were mainly an older crowd, and we sort of got behind, even though we started early. And so what happened when we got up to the tablelands, we realized that, it was already something like 2:00 in the afternoon, and we had not even hit the sign yet. So we realized that we better get moving. So we hurried through the tablelands, got to the sign, spent a few minutes taking our photographs, and hurried back down the mountain. And it was rushed, and it wasn't the experience I had hoped to have. We had great weather, but I was wishing for a more contemplative experience. I'm glad I was there with my friends, but on the other hand, in some respects, I almost wish I was there solo to think more about the moment and what I had done, and spent some more time at the sign and just, reflect. So
it's a difficult thing, though, isn't it? It's difficult to prepare for a moment like that. Everybody has a different version of it. It does get better with time, by the way. I think, I look back on both my summits with such pleasure and such joy, and so I feel so privileged to have done it twice. That it stays with me all the time. That those last moments of, the recognition that all that all that heartache and pain and everything that is taken to get there. I think it's a wonderful moment just to contemplate and have for yourself. And you're right. I think sharing it with other people, perhaps that does take some of that away.
Well, I don't want to take anything away from my trail family. They were
No,
great, and I'm
me,
glad
yeah.
I did it with them. I just wish I'd had the opportunity to do it both ways.
Yeah. Now, I'd like to go back to the main reason I wanted to chat with you. And it's that you and one of our listeners, Don Robinson, have given me the biggest treat I think I could ever receive. I've told listeners about getting the map from Don originally, this lovely, generous gift from Don, and then your generosity in offering to customize the map for me. I've got to tell you, the result is stunning, and it is simply just one of a kind. I'm in my office now. I'm turning as I'm speaking. I can see it there, and it is difficult to describe to people. But at every point of that map, and there's pictures. At every point of that map, I know where I was. I know what I was doing, and it's the most wonderful experience to have this. So, firstly, thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome. Well, thank Don Robinson.
Oh, absolutely, Don as well. There's both of you. It's just been an absolute joy for me. And so the first question is, what was it made you want to take on the challenge of producing a 2-foot high but 10-foot long map of the AT?
The answer to that question is I simply wanted one for myself. I never had planned on offering this to anybody else. I just wanted to create this as a memento for my own hike. And I had experience in, software programming and also land surveying. I did that professionally for a few years. So, and I've always had an interest in cartography, but the answer is I really just wanted one for me. And then after I had worked on it for about 6 months, I showed it to a friend who was also a thru hiker.
Uh-huh.
And he says, "Oh gosh, Larry, that's your trophy map. That's you need to put that out there. I think there are lots of hikers that would love to have that." So that's how the project started.
That is amazing. And I seem to remember you. I'm not sure if my notes are correct here. You got the idea from something to do with David Miller, AWOL.
Oh, correct. I had met David Miller a few times on the trail as he would travel the trail and update his AT guide. I remember meeting him one time in the parking lot at the Boiling Springs ATC office. And at that point, I introduced myself and, I was still hiking the trail. And I said, David, I think there are a couple of places in the AT guide where the elevation profile is not quite right. And David, he's a great guy. He's a software engineer. He's very smart. And he was listening. And I said, well, and by the way, David, I've got, professional land surveying experience. I'm not just a guy with a handheld Garmin. So he says, well, contact me after the trail, after you finish your hike, and we'll talk. And I did. And he wanted to, he kind of had me help him out with the new reroutes for the next book. In other words, they put in new switchbacks every year. So he would have to revise his data. So I helped him out on that. And then it turned into actually a much bigger project. We revised really the whole, we revisited the whole elevation profile. And from that collaboration, actually, that was for the 2016 book. I've done the elevation profile for the AT guide every year since then. In fact, just last week, we did it for the 2021 book.
Wow. And this is using your land surveying experience. How do you do that then? If you don't, is there an idiot's guide to how you do that? Can you sum it up? I mean, what do you do?
I wrote some custom software, and basically we get the horizontal track from the various trail clubs, or at least, Anti-Gravity Gear is the publisher now. And they get the new trail tracks, 3 routes every year from the various trail clubs along the way.
All right.
And then, but vertical just is terrible from a handheld GPS. It's absolutely horrible. So what I do, I've written custom software. I get from the U.S. Geological Survey what they call digital elevation models. And from that horizontal track, I extract the vertical data from U.S. Geological Survey. I think in the the data we use. We have about 94,000 data points on the Appalachian
Wow.
Trail. And so I recompute all those every year, and that's how we build the elevation profile.
Wow. That's amazing. Now, coming back to the map here, this, you wanted a big map for yourself. You got a big map and your buddy saw it and thought people would like it. Is this how it looked? The one I'm looking at now, and say a lot of my listeners have seen it on the video, which now actually is on your site, I know. Is this the one, is this how it was when you first did it, or has it had many changes since?
It's had a lot of changes. Many of the changes really were triggered by things individual hikers wanted, suggestions they had.
Right.
The initial map was actually it still had terrain hill shading, so you can see the topography, but each state was a different color.
Right.
And as an aside, I guess most thru hikers' least favorite state is Pennsylvania. Guess what color Pennsylvania was? Black.
Oh, dear.
And anyway, but I revised those colors over the years, and in fact, I leave it up to the hiker if he wants a particular state, a particular color. I still offer that option. I'll color the states however they like.
Yeah, I say I'm looking at it now, and in the top left-hand corner, you think, or you seem to, but you maybe somebody said this to you, you've got an original copy, as it were, of a white blaze, a full-size white blaze, and you sort of you make a point of telling me that that's not a printing error. That is meant to be a white blaze. Whose idea was it to put the white blaze on?
That was actually my idea. I always wanted it there, and that's actually a photograph of an actual white blaze at Winding Stair Gap, North Carolina, near Franklin.
Oh,
And
I didn't know it was there. How beautiful!
Yeah.
So you've got the. I'm turning around actually away from the microphone, so I don't know if I'm messing the sound up. I apologize for this. So it's had new ideas all the time, and I know it includes, for example, it's got my finishing certificate. You allow space for a saying or a sentence, and I wrote something that I used to say a lot. So how do you think it's going to develop going forward? Is it going to be a continually evolving dynamic process, and as you get our good ideas, that's the thing you'll go with, or do you literally customize it for everybody, asking them what they want?
Well, it's a combination of things. As hikers suggest new ideas, for example, it was George Andrews of Anti-Gravity Gear. He was one of the first people who saw it. I had wanted to put about 4 photographs on the map just because I had a space for 4 photographs. And George is the one who told me, he says, "No, Larry, you've got to put 50 photographs. This is your story. This is your hike story." So it was George who suggested the format of having lots of photographs, what I call the photo bar on the bottom. And
Yeah.
then another hiker suggested having the Katahdin photo up in the title block. And I think you've got that.
Yes,
And then having the trail mantra. In other words, and even the color scheme that you have was developed by another hiker. He and I jointly went back and forth, changing the color slightly. A hiker by the name of Nature Boy who hiked in 2019. And that's been my favorite color scheme so far. And so everyone I do, as hikers suggest new things, I'll offer those suggestions to other people who are doing a custom map as well. So I'm sure it will continue to evolve, and I hope it does.
Have you done many? Because I've seen them on the gallery on your site. How many have you actually done for individual hikers, customized ones?
Actually, not that many. Less than 50.
Wow.
I don't know if the word is not out or what's going on. I guess I'll just say I hope the word's not out. They take a bit of time to do, and it's a bit of work on the hiker as well, because the hiker has to select their 50 photos, which might be hard to do because most hikers have hundreds and hundreds.
There was a very difficult thing, but funnily enough, that I was lucky. I was able to listen to my podcast again to know where I was. I didn't write down every day where I was, but fortunately my podcast did say where I was, so I could track that. Because another thing we haven't mentioned, above the photo bar, but just below the elevation profiles, you've got exactly where I was on each day and how far that particular day's journey was and whether I went northbound or southbound. That is That is immeasurably wonderful. And that is so great for me to know exactly where I was in each of those days. And I think that's a terrific thing. I actually forgot when I was doing the film, to mention that. So I tacked a bit on at the end and went back to record that.
I agree. It's a great feature. It helps you recall your hike, and especially if you did a little southbound section or a slack pack, it's right there on the map. You can see, oh yeah, that's when I jumped ahead and hiked south with some friends. It helps you recall your hike.
It really does. Now, so firstly, before I get onto the last bit, I want to say, where can people find you so they know to look at the maps? I've got to tell everybody, by the way, when you go there, you're going to be blown away by them. I promise you. So tell us how to get hold of you and where to find you.
My website is called Red Eft Mapping. The red eft is also known as the red spotted newt. That's REDEFT mapping.com. And I named my little company Red Eft Mapping because by far he was my favorite little creature on the trail. I would rescue hundreds of them by moving them off trail on the rainy days. And they were the most gentle, docile creature. And they would just kind of look at you and say, oh, thank you for moving me.
By the way, if you went again, you wouldn't be able to go as McGyver. You'd have to go as Red Eft or something like that, wouldn't you?
Probably so. Also, I'm on Instagram at Red Eft Mapping as well.
Okay, I'll include those links in the show notes. Now, even more exciting is that you and Don, I did speak to Don about this as well, obviously, are letting me give away the original map from Don to one of our lucky listeners. Now, I'm kind of throwing you under the bus here a bit. Do you have an AT-related question that we can ask the listeners, or do you want me to come up with one after this interview?
Steve, I've thought about this, and I have not come up with one. And I've tried to come up with a witty one about mapping or the AT. Between now and the time you compile it, maybe I'll come up with one, but I do not have one now.
But we will have one, and I say the original one, it took my breath away. When my girlfriend and I and her son opened it up, it was extraordinary. But when we got the completed personalized one as well, that was also so extraordinary. So I just thank you so much for doing it. I thank Don for starting this whole process, and I really appreciate you coming on and telling us your story, Larry.
Thank you very much, Steve. I've enjoyed it.
You take it easy, okay? Speak to you soon.
All right.
Bye. How about that? We're going to give away one of Larry's maps, and I need to reiterate that this is due to the generosity of Don Robinson, who gave me the map in the first place, and of course to Larry for generously offering to personalize it for me. I know I've said it a few times, but really, you need to see this in the flesh, so to speak. I'm going to add a link to the video of mine in the show notes in case you haven't seen it yet. So, the question. Larry actually recorded the question for me and sent it a few days after we spoke. So, here it is.
Yes, I do have a question, and here it is. In how many of the 14 states that the Appalachian Trail passes through can you find the red eft? And, second part of the question, which states?
Now, that may need a trip to Mr. Google to find out. But as I said, this is an awesome gift to receive. So good luck to everybody who enters the contest. Just before we get on to the ATC part of the show, I wanted to send out more heartfelt thanks to those of you who have taken the time to donate to our shows. Jens Lipperheider and Sondra Lee sent generous donations, while Lisa Rana has kindly continued her monthly donation, with new monthly donors Brian Helton Jr. and PC Personal Training stepping up. It's been quite a week, and I'm so grateful to you all. If you'd like to show your appreciation and keep these shows going, go to hikingradionetwork.com and click on one of the donate buttons for a one-off or monthly sum. Cheers. Now, a last-minute change to our guest from the ATC today, and it really worked out. Alyssa Reck was given about 10 minutes' notice and stepped up with no problem at all. Here is Alyssa. Well, I was hoping to be introducing Charlene Desai today, but unfortunately he's unavailable. But luckily for us, we have a great replacement in Alyssa Reck, who is the social media manager for ATC. Hi, Alyssa. How are you?
I'm doing very well, Steve. How are you?
I'm good. And are you suitably nervous of not knowing what we're talking about today?
Well, I have a couple bullet points, but it is one of those things where you just roll with it.
Go with it. Excellent. And our questions today and our topic today, which is one I did need a little bit of guidance, was why connections matter from engagement to responsible recreation. And that's a leap that has to be taken, obviously. So how do you start with engagement?
Well, I think it starts with when you first hear about a place that you really want to visit. So for us, it's the Appalachian Trail. It's the visitor relationship with the trail is the one that we want to approach first. Yeah. It's learning about, the land you're recreating on, where you're going to access the trail from, but then also learning about why does it exist? So it's like that sort of visitor relationship is kind of where we start with that overall connection and then build a relationship from there by revisiting and getting involved.
Now, unfortunately for you, or unfortunately for me, it's unfortunately for you, I always take tangents on these things. So why does it exist then?
So it exists because Benton Mackay in 1921 had a vision to essentially create a place where people could get away, regardless of whether you're, from an urban community, you're a city folk, or if you're coming from a rural community. He really kind of wanted to create this landscape that people could get away from for, a couple weeks a year. And obviously that's a lot different than, a few months. but
it was his idea that people would spend a sufficient amount of time on the trail to be in the woods and camping in the woods and the whole 9 yards. So that was quite a vision to start with, wasn't it? And that must have been quite revolutionary, I'd imagine.
I mean, it was something where, a lot of people call him a visionary because he wanted to set aside so much energy and time. He wanted to give people an outlet to be able to spend that time in nature where, for a lot of us, including myself, it's a place of, peace, relaxation, and kind of like recentering.
Sure.
And he also, kind of wanted people to use it almost as like their vacation time where they would volunteer on the trail and kind of use some of their hours to, some of their vacation hours to essentially help build it.
So the social engagement, or the engagement, which is social engagement, I guess we're talking about, came about having this amazing trail, and you have responsible for that. Not you personally, but the community, the ATC community has responsibility for that trail. So how do you engage people? Is it now entirely through social media? Do you go to schools? I mean, how is the engagement, how does the engagement take place?
Engagement is it's so important. And I truly think of it as an omni-channel approach. So the ATC does have our education outreach programs that are run by the fantastic Julie Judkins. And so a lot of those have been virtual this year. However, we usually have like the Forest for Every Classroom program. We also have developed a volunteer leadership academy that Leanna Joyner is heading up. Email, and then social media is kind of the big whammy because it is in front of so many eyes, and about 600,000 of them.
Wow. Well, so how do you manage that? And the reason I say is that, and people know on the show that I think social media is a curse and a blessing on our society. And the curse bit is bad, particularly this year, particularly for the Appalachian Trail. There's been a lot of adverse publicity. So is the engagement, I think it's actually improving a lot in the last couple of months, fortunately. Is the engagement a thing that you obviously work on that engagement? What are you trying to tell people? Because if we're going to try to get to responsible recreation, how are you trying to guide them down that path?
So I think a lot of people know that 2020 started out kind of hopeful, and then quickly was not as hopeful.
Nice understatement, yeah.
And it's been quite a transition, and it's been something that I think a lot of people didn't really know how to approach. And so the Appalachian Trail Conservancy was reached out to by the Recreate Responsibly Coalition, along with other businesses, organizations, and nonprofits to essentially come on board the communications committee and in other facets to help develop some Recreate Responsibly guidelines on how people can ultimately engage with the trail and other outdoor spaces in a responsible manner. And a lot of that comes down to several principles that most people are already familiar with through Leave No Trace. So like know before you go, plan ahead and prepare. And ultimately what we're trying to convey to people is that with just a little bit of preparation, you can ultimately change how your hike experience is.
Sure.
So some things that we're asking people to do is we just opened on December 1st, we opened our AT camp registration. So hikes of any duration, whether you're doing just an overnight hike or you're doing a week hike, a multi-week hike, a multi-month hike, just asking people to go ahead and register. It is voluntary. And we're just asking them to go ahead and register just that way they can figure out when there might be lesser of an impact to the trail, and then also to space them out a little bit further.
Yeah.
What we know is that, there are still a good chance that shelters and privies are going to be closed. And so packing a personal shelter system, whether you're, enjoy hammocking or tenting, just making sure that you're doing what you can ultimately to keep your health, safe, but then also keeping other people around you healthy as well. And so it's just those small steps that we can all take that kind of are going to create a big impact.
So we're putting together, or you're putting together, this registration for hikers next year. So the assumption is you're not advising people not to go, but you're accepting that people are going to go and they need to do it responsibly. So where do the closing of the shelters come into play? I know they are closed. Are they not being opened for next year?
So that's something that we just don't know yet. We've had conversations with our partners, and it's just something where, privies tend to already be kind of a a touch point for like neurovirus, which happens every year. And so it's just kind of minimizing those. Yeah.
I mean, really? Oh my gosh.
So it's like, we just want to minimize the chances that, if you're in a shelter with 12 other people, you could potentially, have 12 other people that you haven't connected with ever before. You don't know where they're coming from. They don't know where you're coming from. And so it's better if you just already have a personal tent or hammock, just that way you can, space yourself out. And, we don't really know what else is going to happen in 2020. I think a lot of people do the hindsight is 2020, but now it's like, well, we can't tell the future either.
What a great expression that is going to be in the future. Hindsight is 2020. Yeah. Everyone can't wait for this to be over. So responsible recreation. Do you think this is it's obviously needed, clearly, and I know you say from my own personal experience of just walking around my community, or not my community, just down a road off my community, there's trash all over the place. Is trash and that sort of irresponsible recreation, I personally don't think it comes much from thru-hikers at all. And I know I'm biased because I was a thru-hiker. I think there's just carelessness in everyday life these days. Are you putting that message across in a big way for ATC? Because the Leave No Trace thing, we had a fantastic explanation recently on our Woods Hole retreat by one of your team. I forgot her name for a second, but it's Catherine Herndon-Pell. Yeah, she came and gave us a fantastic demonstration. It lasted over an hour, and I thought, she can't talk about this for an hour.
Yeah,
she could have talked about it for 2 hours, I tell you. It would have been easy for her. And those principles, they should be ingrained almost intuitively, almost from birth. As a human being, you don't chuck stuff away. You are prepared for certain things. Is that message getting across to people, do you think, or is it becoming more of a difficulty to get across to people?
So I would agree that I don't think it boils down to, whether you're a thru hiker or a day hiker. I will say that a lot of thru hikers are quite responsible in practicing Leave No Trace, making sure they're packing it out, making sure they're camping on durable surfaces, those sort of things. But I do think that there is a responsibility, for people that are just visiting for a day or a couple days to really recognize that once they leave, someone has to take care of what they leave behind.
Sure.
It doesn't organically disappear. There isn't a dumpster truck that comes by and hauls it out. It comes down to our trail clubs, the volunteers and other hikers that have actively taken it upon themselves to, carry an extra bag with them just to be able to pick up what they find. And, for this year especially, it's not exactly the most safe thing to do if you don't have gloves and things like that. I would carry gloves anyway, just in case.
So where do you put this message? You've got Facebook, and not everybody's on Facebook. Certainly my generation is, but your generation probably isn't. A lot of your generation possibly isn't anyway. Are you looking for different sources of social media? Because you're a social media girl, so you tell me. Are you looking for different sources that help get the message to people?
Well, currently we're on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Pinterest, but we've also looking to expand into doing a lot more video content and kind of holding space in some of the newer channels for up and coming generations. The hardest part is, what their interest is. So right now we are finding that kind of the big three are where we're settling, but I think there is a lot of opportunity within social media to reach people who aren't actively on some of the main social media channels.
Yeah, I just think we've only had Facebook for 15 years. In 15 years, people will just be remembering Facebook, is my opinion, and there'll be something else going on as well. So, So now I've covered what I wanted to cover. Now you had some bullet points. Have we covered any of them?
Sure. So, one thing that we just kind of want to mention is that we did develop a hiker resource library on our website where you can register on AT Camp. You can learn about Leave No Trace. You can also learn about other safety and hazard risks, whether that's bears, ticks, hunting, things like that. It also gives you a chance. We have a couple checklists for both day hikes and overnight hikes. That way you can make sure that you have the gear you need in order to prepare yourself. So whether that's carrying a mask, so that way you have that when you're going into towns, or, being able to cover up when you're passing someone in close proximity on the trail. We just kind of want to make sure that people understand that, those 10 essentials are becoming like the 12 essentials. And, even in the winter, like you have to add more layers. There's just things that you can actively do to make sure that you are just taking a little bit of the guesswork out of how your hike experience is going to be.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I appreciate that. And I really appreciate you coming on. Send me the links that you think we could valuable for our listeners, and I'll put them in the show notes as well. Okay.
Absolutely. I'd love to.
Now, I know there was one other connection point you wanted to make for the listeners. So tell us about that.
Yeah. So one of the things the Recreate Responsibly Coalition has as one of their overlying themes is build an inclusive outdoors. And that's something that the Appalachian Trail Conservancy has really taken to heart over the last several years, but more so in 2020, as we work to kind of do more outreach.
Sorry, what does that mean though? What does that actually mean?
Yeah, so community in and of itself and kind of building the connection with trail. We know that AT has a very strong community. There's a lot of people that love it. And ultimately that community makes you feel like you belong, where you're valued and appreciated by others. And so that's something that we can all do, is that when we are around people that, maybe don't have that connection yet or still trying to find their way in connecting with AT, is just being welcoming. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, when you feel welcomed, you're more likely to give back to it.
That's fair enough. And you know what? People are welcoming though on the trail. I've done 4,500 miles on the trail, and I've had about 2 arguments. That was it, and they weren't bad arguments. And they were with the same guy, so it didn't really matter. So people are friendly. I think people are very approachable. I think for those of you who haven't been on the trail, you should just step on it one day and just feel yourself transported into another world, and you come across people and they smile at you, they engage you because they haven't got something else to interfere with their day. So I think that's a good message to give. So I appreciate you coming on the show, and thanks for being a great stand-in. And I'll make fun out of Charlene another time.
Okay.
All right.
Thank
Cheers
you very
then.
much.
Bye. I must say I've continued to be so impressed by the people we've had on behalf of ATC on the show. Alyssa was very easy to talk with and has such a command of a subject. I think these chats have gone well, so much so that I reached out to Sandy Mara, the president and CEO of ATC, and asked if she would like to have a more permanent presence on the show, and I've already received a bunch of scheduled topics for the new year. But I don't want it all coming from the one direction. What do you want to hear from the ATC? I mean, for me, it will be a great opportunity for them to give the current state of play every week as the thru-hiking season kicks off in 2021. Maybe trail conditions, local events and so on. What do you think? Email me at steve@hikingradionetwork.com and I'll be sure to take your comments into account as we put this segment together. Thanks again. But now, Ben Crawford's book, 2,000 Miles Together. There were 27 names in the draw that I did this week, and the winner was, drumroll, Erin Driffield. Congrats, Erin. Email me your address and I'll pass it on to Ben, and he'll send you a signed copy of his book. I'm currently reading it and I'm loving it. Thanks to everybody else who wanted a copy of Ben's book and wrote to me. Finally today, Larry Luxembourg's Walking the Appalachian Trail continues to educate us about some of the names who've blazed the trail over the years, so to speak. This week, as I said, the very living Gene Espy is featured. I'll see you next week. Sacagawea, pioneer thru-hikers. There is no reason for boasting of walking as though it were a special talent or virtue possessed by an endowed few. John Kieran, 1953. The AT was designed to be so long that it would seem to have no end. Initially, there was no thought of anyone walking the entire length in a single season, even at the originally intended length of 1,200 miles. Just before Earl Schaefer's 1948 thru-hike, an article in the AT News debunked the notion that anyone could do a thru-hike, even though 6 people had done the whole trail in bits and pieces. But when adventurous souls are told a task is impossible, they immediately begin to find ways to do it. People harboured dreams of a thru-hike long before anyone succeeded, and some attempted to go the distance before Earl. After his hike, the ATC greeted Earl with incredulity. Only after Earl showed hundreds of slides in his journal and discussed the trail in detail did Myron Avery and Gene Stevenson accept his account. For years after, Benton Mackay and others derided thru-hikes as stunts. Earl Schaefer faced formidable obstacles in 1948. Trail maintenance had been spotty for a decade. The hurricane of 1938 and neglect during World War II had left the trail in poor condition. Blazes and trail signs were neither abundant nor clear. Guidebooks were obsolete. Because of a mix-up at the post office, Earl never received the guidebooks he'd ordered from ATC. Instead, he made do with regular oil company road maps and a few local maps of national parks and forests. No one knew how long the trip would take, when one should start, how to resupply, or what weather to expect. Equipment was primitive. The year after Earl's hike, National Geographic did an article on his trip and the trail. This article and other publicity brought new thru-hikers to the AT. In the 50s and 60s, thru-hikers were a close-knit group, hiking and corresponding with one another. Yet the first gathering of thru-hikers was not until the 1972 ATC meeting in Plymouth, New Hampshire. During the 24 years between Earl's hike and the Plymouth meeting, only 32 people had hiked the trail in one season. Today, that many people arrive at Curtailed in a busy September week. Earl, who was ATC corresponding secretary for 5 years, began advising potential thru-hikers in the 50s. In the next couple of years after his hike, several people attempted thru-hikes, but no one was successful until 1951 when Gene Espy became the second thru-hiker. Chester Zion-Gilewski and Martin Papendick became the first to hike from Maine to Georgia, and William Hall did 1,750 miles that year, also southbound. Earl met or corresponded with all 3 of them. He hiked with Hall in Pennsylvania for 3 days and said that Hall, whose average pace was 4 miles per hour, was one of the strongest hikers he'd ever met. Earl, a powerful hiker in his own right, felt worn out when he left Hall at Caledonia State Park. In 1952, George Miller, 72, became the 5th person and first senior citizen to thru-hike, covering the trail in 139 days. When Dick Hudson hiked the trail between 1966 and 1970, he met so few hikers that he can still recall nearly all of them. "I had the trail to myself," he said. On his longest stretch in 1969, he met 4 hikers in 2.5 weeks while covering 300 miles in Virginia. In 1955, Emma, Grandma Gatewood, became the first woman to hike the trail alone and in one continuous trip. 2 years later, Dorothy Laker became the second. Oddly enough, they were also the first people to do a second thru-hike, both finishing with 3 2,000-mile trips. Not until the 70s would another woman hike the trail alone. The first woman to hike the trail in sections was Mary Kilpatrick, who hiked with her husband and friends and finished in 1939. Mildred Lamb, who, like Mary, was from Philadelphia, hiked the trail in 1952 with her husband Dick. They hiked from Mount Oglethorpe to the Susquehanna River, then jumped to Katahdin and hiked south. This was also the first flip-flop, hiking the complete trail in different directions instead of in one continuous line. Grandma Gatewood, who was 67 when she completed her thru-hike, brought a great amount of attention to the trail. The exploits of this gentle-looking great-grandmother captured the country's fancy. Not until Ed Garvey hiked the trail in 1970 did another hiker get such attention. His trip and his book afterward, Appalachian Hiker, came at the start of a growing wave of interest in hiking and backpacking. In 1970, 10 people completed the trail, 6 of whom were thru-hikers. In 1972, National Geographic published its first book on the trail, and Reader's Digest ran an article on the AT. Gene Cashin recalls that the ATC conference was swamped with inquiries after the Reader's Digest article. In 1973, 88 people became 2,000 milers. Among them was Warren Doyle, who thru-hiked in a record time of 66 1/3 days. He's completed the trail 8 times since then. In recent years, 2 more hikers have attracted great publicity to the trail. Dan Wingfoot Bruce has thru-hiked 6 times and section-hiked once, all since 1985. He also has written the Thru-Hiker's Handbook, with mile-by-mile information for AT hikers. In 1987, he spearheaded the Golden Anniversary Expedition. To mark the 50th anniversary of the trail's completion, he arranged for ceremonies as he passed through towns. In 1990, Bill Irwin became the first blind person to walk the entire trail, his near-miraculous feat thrilled people around the world. The most famous person who ever hiked the whole AT received little attention for it. Justice William O. Douglas completed section hiking the AT in 1958, the 18th 2,000-miler. Born in the Midwest, he overcame infantile paralysis and acquired a love for the mountains while growing up in the Pacific Northwest. While serving a record 35 years on the Supreme Court, he continued to hike. In 1954, with the help of many PATC members, Justice Douglas staged a well-publicized walk on the C&O Canal along the Potomac River. The walk led to the eventual defeat of a proposal to turn it into a parkway and preserved it as a scenic trail, including a short stretch of the AT. In Of Men and Mountains, his account of growing up, he wrote, "I learned early that the richness of life is found in adventure. Adventure calls on all the faculties of mind and spirit. It develops self-reliance and independence. Life then teems with excitement, but man is not ready for adventure unless he is rid of fear. For fear confines him and limits his scope. He stays tethered by strings of doubt and indecision, and has only a small and narrow world to explore." Profile: Gene Espy. At 66, still active and involved in the Georgia Appalachian Trail Club, Gene displayed his equipment and discussed his 1951 pioneering trip at the 1993 ATC meeting in Dahlonega. During that hike, a man in Virginia showed Gene a newspaper article about the AT and told him he'd be the second man to hike the trail after Earl Schaefer. Espy said, "It surprised me. I thought it had been hiked lots of times before." In 1951, the first Eagle Scout from Cordell, Georgia, Gene Espy, 24, became the second man to thru-hike the AT. Gene was a Navy veteran of World War II who always wanted to do something different. As a young man, he had taken a long bicycle trip and a long river trip. In 1945, he hiked in the Smokies for a week. In late 1950, he decided it was time to hike the AT. Jean Stevenson of ATC lent him her personal guidebooks and maps. Gene left the last day of May and finished the end of September, 4 months later. He started late because he had to wait for his partner to finish high school. On the hike from Mount Oglethorpe, then the southern terminus, his partner quickly learned that he didn't like carrying a backpack. He took a side trail to get off at Amicalola Falls. From then on, Gene was alone. "I didn't tell my family I was going to hike the whole trail," Gene said. "Nobody knew where I was. If I'd gotten hurt, it would have been 2 or 3 months before somebody would have seen me. There wasn't anybody hiking. I practically had the whole trail to myself," he said. Many times he went for a week without seeing another person. In places, the trail had rock climbs where today's switchbacks make it easier. "A blind man and his dog wouldn't have had a chance then," he said. "I had trouble following the trail myself." Speaking of recent speed hikes, Gene said, "To each his own, but to me, it's like going in the Smithsonian and out the other door." Well, as you see, it was strictly a vacation for me. If he took a side trail, he backtracked to where he had left the AT. He was unable to do about 20 miles of trail, however, because he couldn't find the AT or faced other problems such as flooding from beaver ponds. "I gave it the good, hardest try," he said. His pack was a steel-framed World War II Army pack, purchased for $5 at a surplus store. His pack weight varied from 40 to 50 pounds. On his earlier trip through the Smokies, he had taken 5 blankets instead of a sleeping bag and learned that what you put in your pack wet, you pull out wet. Those wet blankets got very heavy and weren't warm. This time, he took a sleeping bag. 2 pairs of 100% wigwam-cushioned athletic socks lasted him the whole trip. "I washed my feet and socks every night," he said. "I knew the hike depended on my feet." He wore a chamois shirt that was in tatters by Unicoi Gap, Georgia, less than a week into his hike. His late start meant that the AT was a trail in name only. The summer growth of scrub brush had reclaimed the footway, and there were few other hikers then to trample the growth. Gene carried a 4-pound Boy Scout tent. Shelters then were far less common. A 250-mile stretch in southern Virginia had none. I always picked up stones or sticks before I got to a shelter to scare the animals out, Gene said. Since the shelters were rarely used, animals would take up residence largely undisturbed by man. Sometimes he'd be invited to spend the night in a barn on one of the small farms tucked up in remote mountain hollows. Much of the trail then was on rural roads near farms. As late as the mid-70s, some 200 miles of the trail were on roads. Now only quite short stretches of road walking remain. However, the trail crosses more roads and goes by more stores than it did then, according to Gene. He carried the relevant guidebook section in his cap for easy access. He also carried a miner's carbide lamp, but no flashlight, a collapsible drinking cup, an LL Bean hatchet to cut tent poles, a metal canteen, and 2 SOS pads. I'll take sand and clean off my pots, then pinch off a piece of SOS to finish the job. 2 pads lasted the whole trip. Any time I had a chance to get a good meal, I did, whether at a restaurant or at people's homes, he said. I found half a cherry pie in a garbage can in Virginia. That was good eating, he said, and not many thru-hikers would have turned it down. For cooking, he had a black Primus gas stove, and he didn't bother making a single fire the whole way. He put wires on the stove to make a tripod and used a Boy Scout cook kit. He used dehydrated food he'd mailed from home and powdered milk he bought in grocery stores. I'd start to mix it at night, and it would be good by morning. Before the hike, he bought 3 pairs of Maine guide shoes from LL Bean and 2 pairs of paratrooper boots, which he found too heavy to use. In Port Jervis, New York, he used fish cord and a needle to sew the tops of his shoes. He went into a store there, and they wouldn't take a $20 traveller's check. They were scared of it, he said. Gene's appearance, he didn't shave on the trail, might have frightened them. Beards weren't popular then, particularly in the South, where they were viewed as evidence of a drifter or bum. One person who saw the bearded Gene, then 24, said, "That sure is a spry old man." In contrast to the Port Jervis store was a backwoods store in the South that used spring water to cool off drinks. The place had a dirt floor and no electricity, but the people there took his traveller's check with no difficulty. One of Gene's most unusual campsites was atop the 55-foot-high fire tower then standing on Hawk Mountain, Georgia. On top was a platform and a locked trapdoor to the observation deck. He decided to sleep on the tower after hearing wildcats fighting in the area, but there was nothing to prevent him from rolling off the high landing. Gene used his shoelaces to tie one end of his sleeping bag to the tower and his belt to tie the other end. "I slept good," he said. It was raining at the deep gorge of the Nantahala River when he arrived in the afternoon, and the downpour continued the next day. He stayed 2 nights, one of 6 times on the trip that he stayed twice in the same place. "I got caught in enough storms without going into one intentionally," he said. A warden at a North Carolina game refuge learnt that Gene was carrying a pistol in his pack and disabled the gun. Later, Gene found a note inviting him to the warden's cabin for a trout dinner. At Hot Springs, North Carolina, Gene sent the pistol home. Farther north, Gene met a moonshiner carrying a shipment. The moonshiner asked him, "How much are they paying you to hike the government trail?" Sometimes, if you asked for white gas for your stove, they'd think you were asking for white lightning, moonshine. "I tried to avoid the moonshiners," Gene said. "I didn't want to see a still and have someone hurt me." At Damascus, Virginia, just across the North Carolina line, Gene went into a drugstore. He sat on a stool and ordered toast with syrup and a milkshake. When Gene finished eating, he asked how much he owed. Police Chief Orville Corney McNish, who also ran the store, said, "You're all right, you don't have to pay." The chief picked out a handful of postcards. He told Gene to fill out the cards and he'd put stamps on them. He said, "You've got a long way to go. Save your money." Later, Corney put him in a police car and showed him the sights. After the ride, the chief said, "It's getting so late. Why don't you stay at headquarters?" He gave Gene a right nice clean cell. He also gave Gene a note for the woman who opened the store in the morning. It said, "Give this man what he wants for breakfast. He's okay. The chief." Because of his disheveled appearance, Gene had trouble hitchhiking into towns. One evening, he decided to go to the back door of the Skylands Lodge in Shenandoah, Virginia, for a meal. The man there said, "I don't sell anything out the back door," and shut it. So Gene walked in the front door, causing quite a stir. I had a big meal despite the stairs. He had his chance, Gene said. At the Smith Gap Shelter, no longer on the AT, in Pennsylvania, he met Chester Zingalowski, who was hiking the trail from north to south. Chester had tried to hike the trail in 1950, but had run out of money. His pack weighed 20 pounds. He carried a copy of the New Testament. After he'd read a page, he'd tear it out to save weight. Gene was just as weight conscious. According to Louise Williams, when Gene was leaving Snowden, Virginia, he lightened his load by trading 2 nickels for a dime. Farther north, in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, it grew cold and windy. Gene arrived at the huts just after they closed for the season, but fortunately they left food and kept one open room for survivors. During his trip, Gene killed 15 to 20 rattlesnakes and 5 copperheads. He used a 12-year-old walking stick he'd cut as a Boy Scout to check for snakes in the brush along the trail. In North Carolina, he found a 3 or 4 foot snake. I whacked him with a stick and broke off the handle, and the snake wasn't dead either. I believe if you see a rattlesnake, you should kill him, Gene said. Today, poisonous snakes are so rare along the trail that few hikers kill them. He saw several hundred deer along the way, but no moose. Many of the deer were bedded down right on the trail. Near Katahdin, someone snapped a picture of a deer eating out of his hand. I told people I was out in the woods so long it thought I was another animal, he said. What he didn't tell them was that shortly before he'd given the deer some of his leftover food. In the south he saw birds' nests in roots right on the trail. One time a black snake chasing a mouse went right between his legs. After Gene finished his hike, he sent a postcard to his mother from Millinocket, Maine, but his story had already gone out over the Associated Press newswire. A news announcer in Georgia who knew Gene broadcast the report. A neighbour heard the radio report and called his mother. That's the way she learned I finished the trail, he said. During the trip, Gene lost 28 pounds, and he was not a big person to begin with. His trip cost $400, $300 for equipment and food, and $100 for a new suit, a shave, and the trip home. Gene was the 10th hiker to do the whole trail, and the 2nd thru-hiker. I did it the easy way, he said. I was strictly on my own. A graduate of Georgia Tech, Gene works as an engineer in Georgia. In 1981, he backpacked from Mount Oglethorpe to Springer Mountain. It was the first time he'd backpacked since his 1951 thru-hike. Today, Gene still has his gear, and it's in remarkable shape, considering what it went through. In his den, he displays several mementos from the trip, including his walking stick and completion plaque. He never throws anything away, says his wife, Eugenia. I keep account of where my stuff is, Gene says. Doing the AT was one of the highlights of my life. Gene first met Earl Schaefer in 1952, and they've remained friends. When Earl's book, Walking with Spring, came out in 1983, Earl autographed a copy for Gene, to the second of the crazies. In Gene's favourite account of the trip, the son of Lewiston, Maine, called his trip a feat of endurance by a man of fortitude. The paper concluded, the young man set his sights on a distant goal and reached it, and who can say there isn't something worthy in that?